I didn't see hardly anyone sleep most weeks. And that's because what's important to remember is the entire Bible shares one common story, one common theme throughout all of Scripture. And that theme is that God made us to be in relationship with Him. We broke that relationship, and the entire rest of the Bible is Him pursuing us. Think about that. Have you ever had a relationship where the other person continually failed to honor the trust you gave that person? They were continually dishonest. They were continually lying or cheating or doing things that just you couldn't stand. And they knew that. And they promised to be better. And yet, they still messed up. How long would you allow a relationship like that to continue? How long would you go before you said, "That's it. I wash my hands. I'm done. I've had enough"? I think the statistics in our country about divorce, relationships ending in out-of-wedlock births, and the heartache and heartbreak that plagues our country on a consistent basis speaks to that. And the fact that it occurs inside the church too tells us that this is a big problem. But that's what makes the gospel, the Bible, so amazing, is that no matter how bad you and I fail, God says, "I love you. Come back to me, and I will forgive. I will restore." And that's exactly how the book of Leviticus ends. It ends with a discussion about faithfulness. Faithfulness, according to the last 4 chapters of the book of Leviticus, revolve around 3 things. First, faithfulness in devotion to God. When God says, "I want you to be faithful," the first and foremost part of what that means is faithful in your devotion to God. In Leviticus chapter 24, starting in verse 1, Moses records and says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, 'Command the Israelites to bring you pure oil from crushed olives for the light, in order to keep the lamp burning continually. Aaron is to tend it continually from evening until morning before the Lord outside the veil of the testimony in the tent of meeting. This is a permanent statute throughout your generations. He must continually tend the lamps on the pure gold stand in the Lord's presence. Take fine flour, bake it into 12 loaves. Each loaf is to be made with 4 quarts. Arrange them in 2 rows, 6 to a row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. Place pure frankincense near each row so that it may serve as a memorial portion for the bread and a fire offering to the Lord. The bread is to be set out before the Lord every Sabbath day as a perpetual covenant obligation on the part of the Israelites." One thing we've noticed as we move to the book of Leviticus is there are things that you must constantly do to maintain your relationship with God. It's interesting that actually mirrors every other relationship you have. You want a good relationship, it takes work, not just once. My daughter got married in August. It's great that they had a wedding celebration, that they said I do, that they had a great honeymoon and they're doing great. But to make that last, they've got to work at it every day for the rest of their lives. Trinae and I have been married more than 20 years now. The first 5 years, you've heard me tell you before, were rough. I know for me, one of the reasons they were so rough is I spent most of my time trying to figure out why she wasn't doing what she should. But I wasn't working on my stuff. I didn't think I had any. We fixed that. Now I've got stuff to do. And continual stuff to work on. And that's what it takes to have a good relationship, a strong relationship, a relationship that continues to grow. It's that daily devotion. And faithfulness to God requires no less other than a daily devotion to Him. And so when we say faithful, God says, faithful in devotion to me. The second thing He says, faithful in legal responsibility. Now that seems odd. But I think that is so significant. There is a set of rules. God has said, this is what I want. This is what righteousness looks like. This is holiness. This is cleanliness. This is purity. This is sacred. This is what I demand. And our job is to do everything we can to uphold that. And that we're responsible. In Leviticus chapter 24, skipping down to verse 13, they find a man who cursed God. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and said, bring the one who is cursed to the outside of the camp, and have all who heard him lay their hands on his head, then have the whole community stone him. And tell the Israelites, if anyone curses his God, he will bear the consequences of his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of Yahweh is to be put to death. The whole community must stone him. If he blasphemes the name, he is to be put to death, whether the foreign resident or the native. This isn't just about language. This is about a demand from the community of God to honor God, to call sin, sin. It's one of the reasons Paul indicted the church in Corinth for accepting the man who had his father's wife and was sleeping with her and saying, no, don't get me wrong, we'll talk about this in the future, but there's a lot to be said about grace and love. But it doesn't change our legal obligation to God, following His law, His rules, His way. When you're in charge, you get to make those. And this is what God said to do. And so when He says faithfulness, it's not just in devotion, but it's also in right living. In our legal responsibilities to do what we're supposed to do. Finally, faithfulness in remembrance. Faithfulness required so that we will remember God. It's one of the reasons we gather together every week, so that we can remember Him. It's one of the reasons God, I believe, instituted that we celebrate this Lord's Supper, this communion time, to remember what He went through on the cross, so that we will never forget all that He is and all that He's done. In Leviticus 25, the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land I am giving you, the land will observe a Sabbath to the Lord. This isn't just you, but you're to see that Sabbath in the land. Then, skipping down to verse 11, the 50th year will be your Jubilee. You are not to sow, reap what grows by itself, or harvest its untended vines. It is to be holy to you, because it is the Jubilee. You may only eat its produce directly from the field. Down in chapter 26, verse 1, do not make idols for yourselves. Set up a carved image or a sacred pillar for yourselves, or place a sacred stone in your land to bow down to it. For I am Yahweh your God. You must keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I have put in place, God says, things to help you remember who I am. Observe those, because they will help keep you close to God. It's interesting if you read through the Old Testament, and especially the story of Israel, as we go through the Judges, as we go through the time of the kings that restored the traditional sacrifices, the holy feast days, the weekly Sabbaths, honoring God the way they were supposed to, those were the greatest periods of time in Israel's history. It is the individuals that forgot to honor those, that got lazy in their practice. Faithfulness requires remembrance, because you have to remember why you're being faithful. Every one of the feast days, the holy days that we talked about, all are surrounding remembering what God has done. Whether it's remembering how He's responsible for your harvest, or remembering how it's He who brought you out of slavery. It's all about remembering what God's done. And if you can consistently worship and be devoted to God the way He asks you to, if you can consistently be faithful in your legal responsibility of holding to the strictest standards of God's law, following everything He does, if you can be remembering, constantly bringing to your mind all of the blessings God gave you, God says that's what faithfulness looks like. And He says, if you're faithful, open up to Leviticus chapter 26. We're going to spend quite a bit of time here in Leviticus 26, because He says, if you're faithful, I will bless your land. You will reap and gather and harvest almost continually. You will have to get rid of old grain to make room for all the new. You will always be satisfied and have plenty. You will never be in want. He says, if you are faithful, I will bless you. You will be fruitful. You will multiply. You will grow. You will become healthy and strong. He says, if you're faithful, I will give you peace. You won't be bothered by wars, sword, ravenous beasts, dangerous animals, wild animals that would come in. He says, you'll have peace. You won't have to worry. You won't live in fear. Things will go well, because I will protect you. Think about that. God says, if you're faithful, I will be faithful. I will take care of you. I will bless you. I will watch over you. And all that occurs will occur under His provision, His sight, His guidance for your life. Paul says something similar to the church in Rome when he says, everything works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purposes. God will work it all out. He's got a plan. He doesn't always tell us, but that's okay. Some of us like surprises. But that's what he says happens if you're faithful. Then, if you look a little further down in chapter 26, starting in verse 14, but if you do not obey me and observe all these commands, if you're disobedient, if you reject my statutes, despise my ordinances, and do not observe all my commands and break my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will bring terror on you, wasting disease and fever that will cause your eyes to fail and your life to ebb away. You will live in fear. You'll be afraid. Because you won't be safe. You won't feel safe. You'll be ill. That health and blessing, when you don't follow my commands, sickness and disease will follow. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about cleanliness. How God's laws actually helped to make sure the people of God were clean. We talked about the fact that if England followed the Jewish purity laws, the Black Plague would not have impacted them the way it did. Because they would have washed, they would have separated, they would have removed all the things that brought that plague and disease. It would have completely changed it. See, if we don't follow God's laws, we may not realize why. The Israelites didn't know why rats and mice and things were bad. What they knew was God said, bad. Okay, that's it. They didn't know why. We can kind of tell now looking back. The same way sometimes we don't realize why God says to do what He says. I don't get that. Do I really have to do it that way? Yep. There's a reason. You don't have to always understand. But you do always have to obey. And if not, this is what happens. Your land will be barren. He continues on in Leviticus chapter 26 to talk about how you will sow in vain. You will harvest in vain because you will get little. Your life will be hard. And you would think, presented with those two things, God had said enough on the subject. You're blessed if you're good, not so much if you're bad. Okay, well, good to know. He's not done. Chapter 26 continues. Because he says, but if after these things, verse 18, you will not obey me, I'll proceed to discipline you. Verse 21, if you act in hostility toward me and are unwilling to obey. Now this goes beyond just careless disobedience and disregard. This is blatant, in your face. Oh yeah? I'm going to do the exact opposite. That's when my dad would say, it's black. Nope, it's white. There's little specks I can see. The old printers where you printed a thing in black and it wasn't all black. See? Specks of light. The door's open. Well, the door's mostly closed. Yeah, see? That blatant, I will never follow that rule. You give me a rule and I intentionally find a way to disobey it. That kind of a lifestyle, we think, silly people. Silly Glenn. But it's so prevalent. And it was so prevalent even back then that God says, you know what? I know that you're not going to just sometimes disobey because you've casually disregarded. I know sometimes you're going to go out of your way to invent new ways of disobeying for the purpose of only to disobey. And if you do that, if you act hostilely towards me, then you need to know that you won't be just living in fear. You will live in terror. You will look over your shoulder every moment you are awake, and you will not sleep restfully because there really are people out to get you. Because I've sent them. In spite of this, verse 23, of these things, you do not accept my discipline, but act with hostility toward me. Then I will act with hostility towards you. I will also strike you 7 times for your sins. I will bring a sword against you to execute the vengeance of the covenant. Though you withdraw into your cities, I will send a pestilence among you, and you will be delivered into enemy hands. And when I cut off your supply of bread, 10 women will bake bread in a single oven and ration out your bread by weight, so that you will eat, but not be satisfied. And in spite of this, if you do not obey me, but act with hostility toward me, I will act with furious hostility towards you. Not only will you live in terror, you will suffer. There will be pain. You will starve and waste away. He gets even more graphic as he goes on and says you're going to end up eating your own children because you are so hungry. Because you are so desperate for food. You will perish. I will come through your community and I will extinguish the disobedience. Because I will not tolerate it. You have a choice. You have a choice. God says, choose life. And if, after all of this, you find yourself lying in a gutter, wasting away, starving to death, beaten, worn down, with nothing else, praying that death come quickly. If you're repentant, even when you're there, God says, I'll remember you. I will remember you. In verse 40 of chapter 26, if they will confess their sin and the sin of their fathers, their unfaithfulness that they practiced against me, how they acted with hostility toward me, and I acted with hostility toward them and brought them into the land of their enemies, and if their uncircumcised hearts will be humble, and if they will pay the penalty for their sin, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob. I will also remember my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. I'll remember. I'll remind myself why I loved you. I will remind myself of the promises I made if you serve me. Even after you rebel, I will remember my promise. And I will be your God. That's the message of Leviticus. The message of Leviticus reminds us that God says, live for me. If you don't, there will be consequences. Pretty simple. But even once I've inflicted those consequences, if you turn back to me, I will forgive. You know, we talked about at the very beginning of this series, why law? That was the very first lesson in the series. Why give all these laws? God gave it to guide people into a relationship with Him. I was reading and doing some studying, and I found a really cool video about Leviticus. And the way the author explained it was that God's holiness is like that of the sun. You have to keep your distance if you're not prepared to enter into that presence. You can't just willy-nilly go and fly to the sun. You will burn up. The sun's you can't live there. And the closer you get to it, the more prepared you have to be. Think about the regulations of the priests compared to the requirements of the people. The priests had a higher standard they had to live to. The regulations for the high priest, the one who was allowed to enter only once into the holiest of holy places. Once per year. And all of the steps he had to go through in order to be able to just walk in there once. The holiness of God is like the sun. And what the law does, the law detects that unholiness. God's commands, God's rules, God's expectations of us identify and detect areas where you and I are deficient. But what conquers sin is grace alone. Because in the end, it wasn't the animal sacrifices that conquered sin. It was God's gift that He chose to allow Christ's death to pay the penalty for our sin. That's the message of Leviticus. Like it did at the beginning when we talked about sacrifices and related those sacrifices to what Jesus did on the cross. In the exact same way, the entire book points to the fact that the law will detect what's wrong with you. The command to love God and love your neighbor is designed to identify, oh, wait a minute, I'm not doing that. Nope, that doesn't fit with love God. Nope, that doesn't fit with love your neighbor. It's to detect where in your heart, in your life, is unholiness, unrighteousness, disobedience. But the law never fixed sin. It was only God's grace that fixed sin. Which is why next week, when we start a new series, we're talking about grace. That crazy gift. That amazing thing that God did for you and I, so that you and I could have life with Him. And so if, as you've studied and read and listened today, you recognize that the law the rules of God, the expectations of God have detected things in your life that you need to work on. If you recognize that you are unrighteous and need help with whatever it might be, that's why we're called into community, so that we can live together, spurring one another on to righteousness and good works. That's the whole purpose of being here together, is so that we can help each other. Or if you recognize that you are separate from God and that you need to be made right, you want the grace He offers and you don't know how to get it, we would like to pray for you, study with you, encourage you, or help you in any way. Won't you come as we stand and sing?